India, the equivalent of the Google tax in India is the equalization levy, right? So, and if you look at the kind of background to this, um, um, even as early as, just a few weeks ago, in June 2021 at the G7 meeting, there was a decision was taken to kind of tax global corporations where they operate and levy a minimum 15% tax on them, a move that was aimed squarely at tech companies, especially the high-tech, big tech companies. The US government is first pushing for a 21% corporate tax rate, right, which is huge in some ways, right? But there is a lot of resistance to this. And of course, this is in response to tech companies habitually evading tax payments. And we have lots of stories of this from the European Union, from the US, from India as well, and so on and so forth, right? So there are many examples of tech companies kind of evading taxes in the places where they operate, right? So where does all this begin? It begins from a G20 summit that was held in Los Cabos in Mexico in 2012, where world leaders basically expressed concern over what they felt was base erosion and profit shifting, meaning the erosion of tax revenues on account of these companies shifting profits to jurisdictions where they have minimal or no tax liabilities. Like, for example, the Cayman Islands, these offshore places, Bermuda, and some countries like Ireland where taxes are pretty low, and so on and so forth. So they basically asked the OECD to deal with the kind of normative and policy implications related to tax evasion, right? And the OECD came up with a 15-point action plan in 2013 that was adopted by the G20 in the following year. So basically, I think we are still in the process of dealing with this action plan, right? And this plan is to establish a kind of multilaterally based global taxation regime that is a kind of a solution to the kind of really novel challenges posed by the digitization of the economy and the creation of transactional value that involves users, firms, and platforms. This is a tough process, right? Because it is based on the valuation of digitization across all productive sectors, right? And that's a tough one to deal with. So from the very beginning, I think they've had issues trying to understand the basis for value. How do you tax the kind of value that is being created at so many different levels, right? That seems to be a major kind of issue. Okay. So the OECD's action plan was considered by a number of governments, including India. And following a number of delays in this global agreement, because of these delays, regional entities like the EU, along with a lot of other countries, decided to, begin or try and work out their own kind of tax regime, right? In other words, the so-called Google taxes. And so these include the UK's diverted profits tax, the Australian tax integrity multinational anti-tax avoidance law, France's digital services tax, et cetera, right? So I think all these countries have been impatient because they've been waiting for this global kind of a framework for taxing these big tech companies, and in lieu of that particular framework, they decided to push for their own kinds of of taxation regimes, local taxation regimes. Now, for example, France's digital service tax that was announced in 2019 is based on a 3% tax on revenues, not profits, on businesses involved in online advertising, et cetera, et cetera. This has been resisted by the US government. And of course, the US trade representative launched a major 301 investigation into what they perceive as an unfair trade practice, primarily directed towards big tech firms based, and working out of the USA, right? So the geopolitics of this is also pretty apparent, right? And you see this as soon as you deal with the regulation of big tech, you've got to deal with the fact that there's a lot of contestation and resistance in this particular area. So the attempts to tax firms involved in e-commerce, in particular some of the big tech companies, can be seen as one aspect of a larger global drive to regulate the commercial activities of these firms, right? And regulatory issues include privacy, market dominance, free speech and censorship, national security and law enforcement, each of which have been the focus for regulatory action. So you can see that a range of regulatory issues have come to play, right? So at any given time, many of these countries are dealing with a number of regulatory issues, and these are kind of slowly becoming some kind of law in their national jurisdictions, right? So a number of regulatory moves. EU's General Data Protection Regulation, of course, is widely known, and this, offers one of the most comprehensive, regulatory tools available today. There have been a number of antitrust rulings against Google for a number of years. And even in the US, of course, the home of these big tech companies, there have been some major kind of bipartisan antitrust, antitrust, rulings against Google, etc. So the Federal Trade Commission, for example, in the USA is looking at Amazon and Facebook, and the Department of Justice has launched a number of investigations against Google and Apple, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So all these kinds of things are happening at the moment, right? Now, what are some of the challenges facing a Google tax, right? What are the issues related to a Google tax? The OECD, for example, has proposed 3 approaches to taxation. Although the calculation of tax on digital intangibles does seem like a Herculean task in the transactional economy. How does one do this, right? So they've given three approaches. One is a taxation regime based on the taxation of income attributable to users involved in the creation of significant data and brand value. The second is the marketing of intangibles, the taxation of value created through trade in and the multi-sectoral exploitation of data generated through marketing goods and services, and assets based on algorithms and artificial intelligence. And 3, taxation that is based on the significant economic presence of firms that are not located in the jurisdictions that they operate in, right? So how to understand both incremental and aggregated value remains a massive challenge. In other words, the need to align income taxation with value creation, a stated goal of the OECD, is a principle that most jurisdictions agree to, although it is very hard to implement. Right? So that's a kind of background to the equalization levy in India. So in the context of the expansion of e-commerce, and in the light of the action plan offered by the OECD, the Committee on Taxation of E-commerce was established by the Government of India in 2016, and they recommended an equalization levy that was included in the Indian Finance Act in 2016. So foreign e-commerce companies that sell through an Indian arm or have an established office in India or pay income tax are excluded, right? And of course, if you look at the background to this, why do we have an equalization levy? There are some arguments saying, look, one of the reasons is the government trying to kind of raise monies in the context of cuts to corporate taxes for domestic companies to 22%, and of course, new domestic manufacturing companies to 15%. So this is a attempt by the government to raise revenues or taxes from elsewhere, kind of. Okay. Now, while the Indian government, began this whole process in 2016, in 2018, this was followed by the inclusion of an additional concept, significant economic presence, to the Finance Act in 2018. This concept acknowledges that the kind of nexus rule based on the physical presence of companies for tax purposes requires expansion in the light of new business operations that are not based on physical presence, but are based on the economic value of global data flows. So these additions, along with an indirect GST tax on online information, database access and retrieval of services, advertising on internet, providing cloud services, providing ebooks, digital data storage, all these things are attempts by the Indian governments to address the issue of non-tax payment by international digital MNCs who have substantive operations in India. Okay, so the equalization tax is characterized as a kind of presumptive tax, meaning that it is calculated not as is the case with direct taxation based on the company's accounts, but through indirect means used to reconstruct income. And this kind of presumptive tax is often used in cases of tax avoidance, especially profit shifting, and evidence of double taxation avoidance or minimal tax payment in the source country and the country of operation. Okay? There have been two phases to the equalization levy in India. The first phase in 2016, the levy was equivalent to a tax on advertising revenues earned by social media networks such as Facebook and search engines such as Google. In phase two, there's been an expansion of the levy to include a 2% levy on all externally owned companies with annual revenues of US dollars 275,404 involved in e-commerce supply and services, the online sale of goods and provision of services. The levy is applicable to those who have accepted the offer for sale, or placed the purchase order, or accepted the purchase order, or issued a payment of consideration, or supplied goods or provision of services partly or wholly. Now, this is where I think it begins to get complex, right? How do you kind of assess value in the context of these types of transactions, right? And that remains a huge issue for the government. Okay, so now it's not surprising that there's been some kind of a contestation and blowback, and this has of course come mainly from the U.S. And the United States Trade Representative Section 301 investigations were launched in June 2nd, 2020, not only against India but also against France and all these other companies, Germany, the EU, the UK, etc., because of the fact that they were levying these kinds of taxes on these big tech companies. So what they did was they proposed a 25% tariff on 40 Indian products worth $40 million. And this includes, for example, basmati rice, et cetera, et cetera. And they've argued that the digital service tax is discriminatory and unreasonable as tax policy and restricts US commerce. And of course, following the G7, and this is very recently, these tariffs have been, they've decided not to go ahead with these tariffs and suspended in the light of the shaping of this global digital tax regime that the G7 and others have been talking about, right? So there's a possibility that we are going to see this global, digital tax regime, and all countries therefore, following in step with that particular tax regime, right? So I think the equalization levy needs to be seen as a kind of part of a raft of regulations aimed at the conduct and business of digital platforms, right? Because the last session was on fintech, and today, of course, we have the consumer protection e-commerce rules, and we have kind of FDI regulations, the establishment of grievance redressal mechanism under these e-commerce rules, et cetera, right? So there is an attempt to actually deal with the kind of regulations in a broad kind of way. And there are also, of course, information technology guidelines for intermediaries, digital ethics, digital media and OTT content, physical presence, et cetera. And there's going to be a kind of, I think it's already operational, a 3-tier regulatory mechanism that includes a grievance officer, a government panel, et cetera. Now, while all these, these attempts at regulation need to be lauded, there are some major issues and challenges with respect to regulation in India, right? So, for example, the equalization levy, for example, and some of these other regulations are not applicable to Indian-owned companies or e-media support that, companies that get government support. IT guidelines for intermediaries can affect independent media houses, like, for example, the Wire, the Scroll, these types of organizations that are more kind of, independent and perhaps critical of the government, right? So these companies can be adversely affected by these types of legislation. And of course, in the context of the PDP and others, we can talk of, people have argued about the reality of censorship, of control, of the silencing of critics through some of these regulations. And in the context of the equalization levy itself, the people have argued that the language of equalization levy is pretty expansive and pretty vague. So here's one a question posed by Vasil in the Mint, and I quote, "What is implied by the term online sale of goods or providing online services?" In other words, how to deal with situations where only one leg of the transaction is online and the other happens in a physical form. For example, can it possibly take with it as ambit cases where services are booked online but are provided or carried out offline? Consider a situation where booking of a hotel is done online, but actual services of the hotel stay are availed offline. Would such cases also be covered? So Vasil actually offer, the question that is posed is a valid one, and while one can say that there's a need for this type of regulation, things like the equalization tax and Google taxes, etc. The whole issue of how one is going to understand a tax value, the generation of value, how taxation can be based on the generation of value is a tough one, okay, and it's an evolving one, and so hopefully when there is that a global taxation regime, they will resolve some of those issues, and India too will be in a better position to tax some of these big tech companies. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that for the moment. And if there are any, questions that any of you want to ask immediately, you can ask. You can send it, of course, in chat, or we can go to the panel themselves and have questions after the panel. Any questions?
One question I had, unless somebody else has one, because I don't want to go first.
Yep. Go ahead.
It's just a question. In the US, of course, they're bringing in this Ending Platform Monopolies Act. There's part of like 5 acts that are going through at the moment in their sort of, to introduce a domestic agenda rather than simply resist international attempts to regulate these things. But I wondered, since India is kind of taking part in the international debate and introducing like legislation, compatible legislation, is there a position when it comes to looking at the emerging monopolies from Indian companies that are kind of critical partners, as I was saying earlier, in the building of digital India? So, something like an Ending Platform Monopolies Act in India, would be a direct threat to those domestic players and their kind of role in the architecture. So, how does India then deal with that when it comes to its internal regulation?
Yeah, I mean, I think so far I have not come across anything related to how they're going to regulate the internal platforms like Reliance and all these other companies, right? Because I think there is a local politics involved here, right? There is also that whole kind of hyper-nationalist thing with respect to made in India and platforms that are India-based and all this kind of stuff, right? So that's part of the story. Now the question, of course, is how long can they not regulate Indian companies, right? How long can they continue saying that regulation is only for these big tech companies that are based outside, right? And so, at least for the moment, I've not seen any major kind of attempts to regulate local companies, especially big tech companies that are evolving locally, right? That's not on the cards. I haven't seen any of that stuff.
So, because I know they've pursued the transfer pricing cases when it comes to people like Vodafone, but not to their counterparts.
Yeah, exactly. That's what is happening. Right?
In that sense, you can do that when there is no regulation, but once you've made a regulation, then
that's true. Very true. And that, I think that's the kind of argument that WTO will take on. The trade guys will take on and say, look, you can't discriminate, right? If this has to be a level playing field kind of thing, right? And that's the kind of argument that the Section 301 USTR and others are pushing for. That you cannot regulate. You can't discriminate. So that's okay. Are there? Okay, here's one from Siddharth.
Pradip, I was just wondering. So, in what you described, are there tensions between states and the union, like the federal, in terms of taxation or regulation more generally? For example, recently the Delhi Assembly committee, the Delhi Assembly is trying to get the Facebook CEO, the India representative, to come and testify on one of the issues related to the riots. And basically, one of the issues that comes up is that both the center and whether the state legislature could do it. So I'm just wondering, is there that kind of tension that plays out in the larger taxation field or anything that you talked about?
I think this is bound to happen. I think, especially, in the context of, say, say the new government in, say, Tamil Nadu, right, who are pretty, who've got their own agendas with respect to, economic development and how to deal with platforms and all the rest of it, right? So there are bound to be those kinds of issues that become more and more of concern. But taxation itself, of course, is an issue from the center, right? It's a issues that the center gets involved in. But I really feel that this is early days, and that in the years to come we are going to have a complex lot of issues that kind of emanate from the different states with respect to platforms, right? And there has to be some kind of a balancing out of how to deal with these raft of issues that are absolutely going to come up. Okay, I don't think there are any other questions here. So let me then go on to the panel itself. We've got this fabulous group of presenters today. And I'm going to kind of introduce them in the order of presentation, beginning with Scott Fitzgerald. Scott has been working on the India scene for a long while now. And he's a senior lecturer and a discipline lead of people, culture, and organizations at the School of Management at Curtin University. So his research is two-pronged. He deals with issues around industrial employment relations and sociology and political economy, but he's also got a specific interest in the network media economy, cultural industry cooperation, and cultural work. So today, Scott is going to be dealing with issues around reliance in 5G and the role of these local players in the context of some of those issues, Adrian, that you mentioned, right? And regulation in the context of these local industries. The next speaker, Urvashi Aneja, we're really happy that you're on board, Urvashi. I connected with Urvashi about a month ago on the review of a book, The Lives of Data. And Urvashi works with Tandem Research, which is a Goa-based tech policy institute. And they're doing, and those of you who are not kind of familiar with Tandem Research, I'd urge you to go and check them out. And Urvashi's current work examines the politics, ethics, and governance of algorithmic decision-making systems in the Global South. And she's served on a number of government committees for artificial intelligence and frontier technologies. And it's been recognized as one of the top 20 AI researchers in India in 2020. She's also Associate Fellow at Chatham House, a tech and social justice champion at the World Economic Forum, etc. So she comes with lots of credentials, and we look forward to hearing you, Urvashi. And Urvashi will be talking about big tech and regulation today. And then we're also very fortunate to have Amber Sinha with us, and he'll be the third speaker. And Amber is, of course, a lawyer interested in technology, the internet, and how the law engages with them. And he is now the kind of CEO of the Center for Internet and Society that we're all familiar with. And he's kind of intrigued by the impact of emerging technologies and existing legal frameworks and how they need to evolve in response. So I think at the CIS, he manages programs on privacy, big data, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. And today's talk, Amber is going to be talking about privacy, the Privacy and Data Protection Bill and its relationship to regulation, right? So these are the three panelists that we have. And we're going to begin with Scott Fitzgerald.